It was just after 10:00 a.m. when Judge Raymond Carter eased his black Lincoln Continental off I-94 at the Pleasant Grove Rest area roughly 40 miles west of Lansing. The morning air carried a cool Midwestern crispness that bit at the edges of his tailored slate gray suit, an ensemble Raymond regarded as both professional uniform and personal armor. He slid his slim leather portfolio into the passenger seat, its contents full of notes for the governor's noon Justice Reform Roundtable, and allowed himself a moment to inhale the faint tang of pine and asphalt to steady his thoughts before the day's work began. The rest area lot was hushed, save for the low hum of distant engines and the chirp of late summer cicadas in the nearby grass. Raymond stepped from the Continental polished shoes clicking on concrete and paused by the driver's side door. He adjusted the knot of his light blue tie, checking that his pocket square lay flat. In his mind's eye, he rehearsed his opening remarks, the necessity of accountability, the promise of equitable policing, the dignity every person deserves. He breathed deeply. Nothing about his appearance or his routine should have drawn attention. Yet a minute later, flashing blue lights painted his polished bumper in stark accusation. In his rearview mirror, Raymond saw Officer Jeffers' cruiser roll to a stop behind him. No siren, just the sudden implication of wrongdoing. He remained calm, hands at 10 and two posture-straight eyes forward. "Good morning, officer," he said, lowering the window. His voice was steady, unmarred by surprise. Jeffers peered inside, gaze flicking over the judge's thread-count shirt, the leather portfolio, the impeccable finish of the Continental's paint. "We received a report of a stolen vehicle matching your description," he said, voice flat and emotionless. Raymond suppressed a tightening in his chest. "I'm not aware of any such report," he replied evenly. "This is my personal vehicle. I'm simply taking a break before a meeting in Lansing. Would you like to see my registration?" But Jeffers was unmoved. He leaned in closer, the brim of his hat cutting a shadow across his eyes. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. There was no question, only command. Raymond complied without haste. He placed his portfolio on the hood and straightened the jacket over his shoulders. The fabric rustled softly like paper, turning in a silent library. He stepped down onto the asphalt heart rate, measured mind cataloging every detail, the texture of the pavement under his soles, the muted buzz of electricity from the rest area light post, the sharp scent of engine oil lingering from earlier arrivals. At 6 feet tall, his frame cut a composed silhouette against the cloud-streaked sky. "Turn around," Jeffers said, producing handcuffs with a practiced flick. Before Raymond could speak, Officer Rake arrived, her uniform crisp badge flashing in the sunlight. She hesitated, eyes flicking between Jeffers and the judge, awareness dawning that this stop was unlike any routine check. Raymond turned slowly, hands rising in relinquishment, though he had done nothing to warrant suspicion. "Officer," he began, voice firm but respectful, "I do not consent to a search of my vehicle." The words were clipped, precise, an assertion of his rights, not an accusation. Jeffers' response was immediate. He snapped the cuff onto Raymond's left wrist, and then the right, each click sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet lot. The metal bit into his skin, leaving red crescents. Rick watched silently, unwilling to intervene. Handcuffed, Raymond was guided to the rear of the cruiser. The door swung open with a metallic groan. He stepped inside, posture unbowed, and waited as the door closed behind him. Through tinted glass, he glimpsed the robin-egg blue sky and distant treetops. He thought of the round table, the governor, the assembled policymakers, the promise of change. None of that seemed to matter in this moment. At the Jackson County precinct, the fluorescent lights above hummed in dispassionate monotone. Raymond sat on a hard plastic chair, wrists marked by the chill of steel. He maintained a calm exterior, though internally he catalogued indignities the way Jeffers refused to look him in the eye. Rick's quick aside to a desk officer, "Thinks he's special." The palpable shift in atmosphere whenever a newcomer realized this was no ordinary detainee. He asked politely 3 times for permission to place a quick phone call to his clerk to confirm his identity to ensure someone would cover for his absence at the round table. Each request was met with a curt shake of the head or a vague later. No one offered water. No one explained the charge beyond obstruction. He felt the weight of each passing minute. 10:30, 10:45, 11:00 ticked by on the glare of a wall-mounted clock. Unseen by the officers, a college student in the corner filmed the scene on her smartphone. The 27-second clip would soon travel far beyond these walls. The judge's composed silence, the officer's casual harshness, it all fit a narrative too familiar to ignore. Raymond leaned back, hands still cuffed, and listened to the precinct's choreography. The tap-tap of keyboards, muffled hallway footsteps, whispered conversations halted when he met an officer's gaze. He recognized in himself the same stillness he had valued in defendants, the careful control of emotion, the refusal to dramatize injustice. He reminded himself that true change depended not on novel outcry, but on stark evidence of wrongs laid bare. At 11:58 a.m., Sergeant Pamela Yates, her gray hair pulled tight, entered. She paused at the door, assessing the scene with practiced scrutiny. "How long has he been here?" she asked. A constable replied, "Just under 2 hours. Charge is obstruction vehicle match." Yates approached Raymond, eyes narrowing. "Sir, have you been advised of your rights?" she inquired. He nodded. "Yes, ma'am. But I have not been allowed to contact my office. I have a scheduled speaking engagement. If not attended, it will be considered a no-show." Something in his tone compelled her. She motioned to a nearby desk and typed his name into the terminal. Raymond Carter, Harvard Law, 93 Presiding Judge, 14th District. She double-checked the file photo, same slate gray suit, same composed expression. Her shoulders slumped as comprehension spread across her face. Returning to the holding area, Yates opened the door. "Judge Carter," she said quietly. He looked up, expression unchanged. "Yes, Sergeant, I apologize," she offered, extending her hand. "You're free to go. I'll personally arrange transport to Lansing." Without another word, she let him out. The precinct seemed to exhale as he passed officers at desk, froze mid-task, their earlier confidence replaced by a flush of guilt and uncertainty. Outside, Raymond stood once more in the crisp air. The handcuffs were removed. His wrists throbbed, but his resolve remained intact. Across the lot, the student lowered her camera. He did not scowl or raise his voice. Instead, he adjusted his tie, opened the Continental's driver's side door, and settled back into the seat. As he closed the door, unaware of how many unseen eyes had watched, a single thought anchored in his mind. Dignity once lost must be reclaimed, not through anger, but through steadfast presence. He glanced at his watch, 12:05 p.m., and then drove east toward Lansing, the engine's hum punctuating the humbling echo of that morning's events. Behind him, the rest area returned to silence, save for the faint memory of flashing lights. Ahead lay the promise of an urgent, reshaped discussion, and the knowledge that sometimes a single moment of unjust silence can speak louder than 1,000 words. As he merged onto the highway, Carter could not yet see how his own quiet endurance would ignite a broader call for change. But he sensed the air around him had shifted, and that the true journey was just beginning. A day after his wrongful detainment, Judge Raymond Carter found himself sitting alone in his home study, the late summer light filtering through plantation shutters and painting stripes across his polished oak floor. He still felt the weight of the steel cuffs at his wrists and the chill of the precinct's fluorescent glare. But today, the echo of that injustice was sharper. It was no longer isolated to one rest area lot. It had spread like a stain across social media feeds and news broadcasts. His slate gray suit, the very fabric that had marked him as other the morning before, hung solemnly on a mahogany stand in the corner, a silent witness to how appearances could become accusation. Carter rose and crossed to the suit, brushing his fingers along its lapel, as though greeting an old friend turned traitor. He thought of the cool Midwestern air that had once made that fabric feel like armor. Now it felt like a banner, one that had been used to brand him. He replaced it carefully, then returned to his desk and opened a fresh journal. He would not let silence conceal his experience, but neither would he let anger define him. In practice, he would catalog each slight, each moment of neglect, for they all held lessons, not only for himself, but for the system he had vowed to improve. By mid-morning, the 27-second video filmed by a college student at the rest stop had exploded across TikTok, Twitter, and Facebook. The clip opened on flashing lights cut to Carter's calm greeting and ended with the snap of metal on metal as his wrists were cuffed. Beneath the video, comments ranged from outrage to weary resignation. When will profiling end? Imagine being that dignified under duress. Yet amid the fervor, a darker undertone circulated. Maybe there's more we don't know. Even the best-intentioned viewers sometimes slipped into doubt, unwilling to confront their own biases. Carter watched the reactions on his television, his reflection streaked across the screen. He recognized that public empathy too often hinged on personal connection. A judge in a suit would arouse more compassion than an unarmed teenager in a hooded sweatshirt. He understood that isolation was woven through every profile-based stop. Those without status lacked advocates, cameras, or hashtags. Their stories vanished in the echo chamber of authority. He closed his eyes and envisioned every defendant he'd once encountered, hands cuffed too tight, voices rising in panicked dignity, stripped before any hearing. They were the faces for whom today's noise would fade tomorrow. Around 2 p.m., his phone rang. It was his clerk confirming that his appearance at the governor's roundtable was rescheduled for the following morning. She asked if he wished to postpone altogether. He declined. The symbol of his suit, tarnished as it seemed, was precisely the anchor he needed. The next day he would wear it again, proof that dignity could be reclaimed thread by thread. Late afternoon found Carter in his Lincoln Continental once more, this time parked outside a small recording studio in Lansing. A local public radio station had invited him to discuss his experience on their Justice Reform podcast. The sidewalk was calm. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves along Grand Avenue. When he stepped out, the station manager offered him a glass of water and showed him into a booth lined with foam panels. "Judge Carter, thank you for joining us," the host said, offering a quiet nod. "Thank you for having me," Carter replied, settling into the swivel chair. He tucked his portfolio under the desk and removed his suit jacket, draping it neatly over his chair back. Even in his light blue shirt and tie, he projected the same composure. The microphones clicked on. "Yesterday, you went from respected jurist to detained suspect in a matter of minutes. What was it like to experience that reversal of roles?" He inhaled steadily. It was a stark reminder that in matters of profiling, authority can work both ways. "In the courtroom, I am the arbiter of civility. Outside, I became a case study in presumption." His voice was measured, carrying the weight of a man who had spent decades shaping others' lives by sentence and ruling. "I learned that dignity is not a privilege, it's a right. Yet in my detainment, that right was overlooked. For nearly 2 hours, I was a statistic rather than a person." Silence followed. The host adjusted levels. Many listeners have asked, "Why did you remain so calm?" "Weren't you angry?" Carter allowed a brief pause before answering. Anger is a visceral response to injustice. But when anger is directed at individuals instead of systems, it risks becoming a spectacle rather than a catalyst. My calm was deliberate. It highlighted that profiling hinges not on behavior, but on identity. Had I raised my voice, the officers might have labeled me resistant. Instead, I refused to give them that narrative. Outside the booth, the producer scribbled notes. Carter's words would soon travel far beyond the station's modest signal. Yet he felt the solitude pressing in. The podcast would air, the public would react, and the next wave of attention would crash until the world moved on to another story. That cycle of attention and neglect was the very definition of isolation. After the recording, he stepped back into his suit jacket and left the station. On the sidewalk, pedestrians glanced his way, some nodding in recognition, others offering polite smiles. No one asked, "Were you okay?" No one offered a ride. Their good intentions lay dormant. Another form of secondary isolation, the unwillingness to reach beyond sympathy to tangible support. As dusk settled, Carter drove home along tree-lined avenues. Streetlights flickered on, casting halos over wet pavement from an earlier rain shower. He parked in his driveway and retrieved the suit once more, placing it into a garment bag. He labeled it for tomorrow and tucked it behind a closet door, an unspoken promise that the fabric of dignity would be woven anew. Inside, he brewed a pot of tea and sat at his desk. A stack of legal briefs awaited his review, cases unconnected to his own ordeal, but vital to the justice he dispensed daily. He opened the first file and began to read. The words on the page offered a familiar: refuge statutes, precedents, reasoned arguments. In that moment, isolation felt purposeful rather than punitive. Yet in the quiet of his study, Carter acknowledged the deeper isolation that profiling inflicted on so many: the fear of being judged by outer markers, the humiliation of having one's narrative erased, the uncertainty of whether any silent dignity would stand against suspicion. He resolved that his next remarks at the roundtable would not focus solely on policy mechanics, but on the human dimension of reform, the solitary courage of those who endure without cameras, whose stories remain unheard. He closed his journal and blew out the lamp. Tomorrow would demand presence. He would stand before the governor and her advisors, his suit once again a symbol of his voice. But tonight, in the sanctuary of his home, he honored solitude as a forge where indignation is tempered into resolve and where the quiet seed of hope germinates in the fertile soil of introspection. And as the house fell silent, Carter knew that his isolation was both an indictment of systemic apathy and a crucible in which the resolve for meaningful change was taking root. After enduring hours in custody and witnessing the video of his detainment spread across every social feed, Judge Raymond Carter found himself summoned to the Michigan State Capitol's Justice Reform Roundtable the very next morning. The image of his slate gray suit, once weaponized as evidence against him, had become a rallying symbol for accountability. Now standing beneath the Capitol's soaring dome, he prepared to transform that symbol into systemic change. He entered room 312 at precisely 10:00 a.m., the oak double doors closing behind him with a hush that silenced the low murmur of aides and advisors. The polished walnut table at the center stretched nearly 20 feet long, ringed by leatherback chairs. Governor Ela Marston sat at the head, her expression measured beneath the glare of early morning sunlight streaming through tall windows. Policy analysts, civil rights advocates, and state trooper liaisons filled the remaining seats, their notebooks and tablets arrayed before them like shields. As the last door clicked shut, a microphone crackled, a soft pop drawing every eye forward. Raymond loosened his navy tie and placed his portfolio on the table, its leather spine creaking softly. He paused, drawing a breath as though inhaling the gravity of the moment. Then in a voice both calm and resonant, he spoke. Yesterday, he began, I was approached at a rest area on I-94 west of Lansing, handcuffed without cause and held for nearly 2 hours. His tone never cracked, yet each word carried weight. No warrant was shown. No report was filed at the time. Only suspicion based on appearance. Behind him, the governor's aides exchanged glances. Outside the room, silent cameras recorded every cadence. A recording device clicked on a table at his elbow. Raymond continued. In that moment, the dignity of the individual was traded for the narrow comfort of presumption. He let the silence settle like a stone dropped in still water. We speak of procedural reforms of training modules and checklists, but without a commitment to respect the person before us, policy becomes performative. A legal advisor shifted in her seat, the rustle of her pen on notepaper, audible in the quiet. Governor Marston leaned forward. Judge Carter, your experience reframes our entire agenda, she said. We must go beyond best practices to enforce real accountability. She tapped a silver gavel that lay before her, an emblem of authority now poised for more than ceremonial use. I move that we establish an independent review panel to examine stops and searches statewide with immediate effect. Hands rose in approval. A stenographer's fingers tapped out nods, the clatter of keys rising like a tide. When the motion passed unanimously, the gavel strike echoed through the chamber, sharp, decisive, and galvanizing. But the true climax followed within hours. The review panel convened in the Capitol's hearing chamber, where marble columns rose to a vaulted ceiling. Journalists packed the public gallery, microphones clustered on a table like wildflowers in bloom. At the center sat a 3-judge bench, Raymond Carter, in his black robe between 2 senior jurists from neighboring districts. Across from them sat officers Jeffers and Rick, now in ill-fitting civilian suits, their uniforms exchanged for borrowed civility. The room fell silent as the 27-second video was played on a large screen. The flicker of blue lights and the snap of cuffs filled the space. Carter watched with analytical detachment, noting every hesitation in Jeffers' motions, every glance Alright cast downward. When the footage ended, the room remained steeped in a collective intake of breath. Carter rose, placing both hands on the bench's polished surface. Officers Jeffers and Rick, he said, voice measured, you stand accused of violating departmental protocol, denying constitutional rights, and undermining public trust. He paused, letting the formal charge settle. Under Michigan law, an officer must verify reasonable suspicion before any detention. In this case, no stolen vehicle report existed at the time of the stop. He signaled to the state police scribe, who produced dispatch logs and body cam transcripts. As each discrepancy emerged, timestamps that contradicted Jeffers' claims, A lack of identifying queries to Riek, a collective stir ran through the gallery. Reporters leaned forward. Aides exchanged impressed looks. Finally, the panel's presiding judge cleared his throat. We find that the actions taken were unjustified and in direct violation of departmental standards. Officers Jeffers and Rick are hereby suspended without pay, pending a full investigation by the Attorney General's office. Further, we order an audit of all stops and searches conducted by both officers over the last 3 years. The decision read in a steady voice landed like a verdict delivered on a brass scale. As the gavel came down, a ripple of murmurs surged through the room. Jeffers stared at the bench, jaw clenched, his earlier smirk vanished. Riek's shoulders slumped, eyes brimming with shame. Reporters swarmed to capture their departure. In that moment, the courtroom ceremony had done more than correct a single injustice. It had illuminated systemic failures for public scrutiny. Outside the hearing chamber, the officers were met not by jeers, but by a profound, uncomfortable silence. A few journalists murmured words of sympathy, but no one cheered. The gravity of accountability washed over the corridor like slow-flowing water. Even the echo of their own footsteps sounded hollow, as if the halls themselves recoiled at the breach of trust. Then came the quietest moment of all. A young attorney representing the state police union stepped forward and addressed the panel with a tremor in his voice. On behalf of the Michigan State Police, he began, "I offer our deepest apologies to Judge Carter and to the people of Michigan. We failed to uphold the standards we pledged to protect. We will cooperate fully with this review and work to restore the public's confidence." His words, though simple, carried the weight of institutional contrition. Raymond Carter inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the apology, without expression of triumph. In his calm acceptance, there was both forgiveness and expectation that genuine reform would follow, not merely statements. The press captured the moment, a judge and 2 officers united by public penance rather than division. As the hearing adjourned, Governor Marston emerged from the chamber into a flurry of cameras. She clasped Carter's hand and pressed a briefing document into his palm. "This is just the beginning," she said quietly. "Thank you for leading with both strength and grace." He offered a small nod. "Thank you, Governor." Beyond the cluster of reporters, service-parked cars reflected afternoon sun on the Capitol's granite steps. A breeze tugged at the banners overhead, bearing the state seal and the words integrity, justice, service. Raymond paused at the threshold, feeling the weight of what had transpired. His suit, now cleaned of metaphor, hung behind him like a flag restored to its rightful place. The crowd's applause, muted and respectful, felt like a benediction rather than fanfare. He did not linger. With measured steps, he descended the marble staircase, each footfall resonating like a heartbeat. Around him, the world had shifted. Policies had been rewritten. Officers had been held to account, and public trust fragile, as spun glass had begun its slow repair. As he reached the final landing, a reporter called out, "Judge Carter, what comes next?" He paused, hand on the banister, and looked out at the sunlit plaza. Now he replied softly, "We see how deep the roots go." And with that sober acknowledgement, he walked away into the waiting corridor, aware that the ceremonial climax had been reached, but the true work of change was only beginning. The morning sunlight filtered through honey-colored maple leaves as Judge Raymond Carter stepped onto the polished stone steps of the Michigan Law Enforcement Training Academy in Lansing. Just hours earlier, in a solemn hearing room beneath the Capitol dome, he had presided over the disciplinary review of the very officers who wrongfully detained him. Their suspension and the statewide audit that followed marked a watershed moment in Michigan policing. Now, 3 months later, he stood again beneath fluttering state flags, not as a defendant or an accuser, but as a living testament to change. A gentle breeze carried the tang of fresh-cut grass from the parade grounds below, mingling with the muted hum of morning traffic along Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard. Carter's black robe, freshly pressed, felt different this spring, less like the weight of the bench and more like the mantle of purpose. In his right hand, he held a slim folder notes for his address to the 50 cadets lined up before him. Their boots were buffed to a mirror shine, their uniforms crisp, shoulders squared. He watched as they stood in formation beneath the flagpoles, each flag snapping in the breeze. He inhaled deeply, recalling the crisp Midwestern air that had once turned his slate-gray suit into illusory armor. Then he let his gaze drift to a small exhibit just inside the academy's entrance. Behind glass rested that very suit carefully preserved on a mannequin. Below it a plaque read, Judge Raymond Carter, Symbol of Dignity Restored 2025. The suit's lapels were unwrinkled, the light blue shirt beneath still immaculate. It was no longer a banner of suspicion, but an emblem of resilience and reform. As the ceremony announcer introduced him, Carter approached the microphone with measured strides. His robe whispered against the marble floor. Without notes, he began in a voice both warm and resolute. 3 months ago, I stood where you stand now, bright-eyed, eager to serve. And in less than an hour, I found myself handcuffed behind a cruiser in a rest area parking lot. A murmur rippled through the assembled cadets, but Carter held their attention. That moment taught me and our state police that respect cannot be assumed. It must be earned moment by moment. He paused to let the weight of his words settle like dew on the spring grass. When I declined to consent to an unlawful search, I was exercising the same rights you will uphold for every citizen you encounter. Today's reforms, bias recognition, de-escalation protocols, independent reviews will shape your careers. But policies alone are only as strong as the individuals who enact them. A cadet in the front row, a young woman from Kalamazoo, shifted slightly as her eyes locked on Carter's. He remembered her face from a training session he had attended weeks earlier, noted her thoughtful nod as he spoke about empathy and enforcement. He imagined her carrying these lessons into patrol cars and precinct interviews, perhaps recalling his measured tone when she too felt the weight of authority. Carter described how the independent review panel had not only suspended officers Jeffers and Rick, but had also led to the auditing of more than 200 stops across Michigan in the past 3 years. From Flint to Grand Rapids, he said we have re-examined cases that might once have slipped through the cracks. In over 24 instances, charges were dropped, records expunged, and apologies issued to innocents who had never known their rights. He let those statistics breathe, acknowledging each person's dignity reclaimed. He closed his speech with a quiet exhortation. Your role is not to wield power, but to protect dignity. Every name you hear, every face you see carries a story. Listen first. See the person before the uniform. And remember, change often arrives not with sirens blaring, but in the small decisions you make, whether to offer water to someone sitting on a curb, to speak words of calm instead of commands, to honor a name before drawing a conclusion. When he finished, there was no thunderous applause, only a respectful silence that spoke louder than cheers. He nodded once as if sealing a promise, then stepped away from the microphone. As the cadets dismissed into neat rows of clapping families and fellow recruits, Carter walked toward the exhibit of his historic suit. A young recruit approached him, eyes bright. Sir, the recruit said softly, thank you for standing for what you believed in. He gestured toward the preserved suit. It's inspiring to see that symbol here. Raymond smiled, placing a gentle hand on the glass case. That suit belongs to all of us now, he replied. Not just to remind us of past mistakes, but to guide our future actions? The young man nodded, turning back to join his classmates. Carter watched him go, then stepped back and turned down the hallway. Portraits of past academy superintendents lined the wall's stern faces in sepia tone, but his own image had been added recently, standing beside the display case. He paused before it, a life-size photo of him in that moment of detainment, calm despite the cuffs. Below the caption read, Dignity in silence can speak louder than accusation. Continuing on, Carter passed a newly unveiled training annex named the Integrity Wing, where classrooms were dedicated to community police partnerships and restorative justice techniques. He saw banners proclaiming, "See me as human first," and accountability starts at recognition. The corridors felt different now, a living museum of lessons learned, rather than static halls of tradition. At the end of the wing, he entered a small memorial garden behind the academy. A bronze bench etched with the words, "Restoring Dignity." One name at a time faced a grove of young oak trees. Beneath the largest oak, volunteers had placed small stones painted with citizens' names, men and women who had filed bias complaint forms and received apologies thanks to the statewide audit. Carter knelt and gently touched a stone inscribed Maria Torres. He remembered her case, a mistaken stop on US 23. A frightened mother handcuffed in front of her children. Her record had been cleared. Her complaint had sparked one of the first policy revisions. He rose and sat on the bench, closing his eyes to the soft rustle of leaves. The sunlight danced through branches overhead, casting shifting patterns across the petals of spring flowers planted nearby. Here in this quiet sanctuary, Carter reflected on how a single act of injustice had seeded a network of small changes, each one a testament to the power of one man's refusal to let his dignity be stolen and to countless officers' willingness to learn. The afternoon light grew warmer as he stood and made his way back toward the main building. His phone buzzed with messages invites to speak at law schools in Detroit, panels in Chicago, op-eds awaiting his approval. Yet as he crossed the courtyard, he resolved to limit his engagements. He would speak where his words could root the deepest in small towns and big cities alike, wherever policies were still words on paper rather than lived practices. When he reached his car, a quiet black Lincoln Continental parked under a redbud tree in bloom, he paused. The emblem on the hood reflected sunlight like a beacon. He placed a hand over it, feeling its smooth coolness. The memory of cuffs and fluorescent glare had faded into purpose. The road ahead would demand vigilance reforms needed, monitoring new recruits needed, mentoring communities needed, rebuilding of trust. He settled into the driver's seat, picking up his portfolio once more. As he started the engine and eased onto Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard, he glanced at the exhibit of the suit displayed in the Academy's lobby, visible through the glass windows. It stood as a silent promise, a symbol transformed from suspicion into solidarity. And as he drove back toward Lansing's downtown skyline, the late afternoon sky painted in salmon and lavender hues, Judge Raymond Carter carried with him a simple, enduring truth. Real legacy is not cast in stone or spelled out on plaques, but nurtured in the hearts of those who choose to see dignity first and who pass that vision forward one quiet act at a time. Hoy ChatGPT.